Hello, I'm Susan Stark. I am the Director of Program for the League of Women Voters. Welcome to this first briefing of 2025. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan national organization which supports positions that deal with such things as civil rights, voting access, human needs, climate, immigration, and other issues related to strengthening our democracy. League membership is not for women only, and we invite men to join. As Director of Program, I'd like to tell you that program writ large in League covers the dual goals of education and advocacy. Voter education is one of our primary activities. So for tonight's presentation, entitled Looking Ahead, the 2025 Colorado Legislative Session, we have invited three speakers who will discuss the Colorado state budget and the likely legislative proposals that our senators and representatives will consider this year. League of Women Voters briefings, whether in person or virtual, are open to the public and free of charge. If you are an attendee who is representing another organization, please let us know that in the chat. Tonight's briefing will be recorded, is being recorded, and will include the speaker's slides. It will be available on our website at lwvdenver.org within about 2 days. So if you're not a copious note taker the way I am, and you feel like you missed something, you can always go to our website and you'll be able to hear the entire briefing, or if you know somebody who can't make it tonight. I'd like to mention our upcoming programs and briefings. On Tuesday, February 18th, also by Zoom, we are giving an update on the National Western Center, which voters helped to fund by voting bonds and regional tourism tax in 2015. We will hear from Brad Buchanan, CEO of the center, and Daryl Watson, the city councilman, who represents the neighborhoods that surround the center. On Tuesday, March 4th at 5:30 by Zoom, we will hold a briefing entitled Our Federal Judicial System 101. We had originally scheduled this to be in person at Montview Presbyterian Church, but we decided to do it by Zoom because we can, again, we can record it and put it on our website for anyone to hear, including a lot of the local leagues around Colorado. The federal courts and Supreme Court have been in the news a lot recently, but how many of us remember much about that high school civics class that talked about the origins, history, and functioning of this important third branch of government? Though the topic may sound dry to you, our study group presenters will make it as lively and thought-provoking as possible. Please join us on March 4th. On February 11th, though our briefings are open to the public, League of Women Voters will hold an in-person meeting at Montview Presbyterian Church at 5:30 for members only. This presentation will be from Jeff Oster, who is on the Legislative Action Committee of the League of Women Voters of Colorado, which formed a First Amendment religious freedom study group. The group has done a lot of research on the First Amendment rights and Christian nationalist movement and other influences of such groups on issues like utilizing our tax dollars to support religious-based schools, on the limitation of full reproductive health access, and other facets of civil rights. The meeting is for League members only because it will relate to our coming to consensus about formal state League positions on religious freedom. Maybe some of you who aren't members or who need to update your membership would like to join League to be able to be a part of this educational discussion and weigh in on this topic. I'd now like to introduce our speakers for tonight. Caroline Nutter is the legislative coordinator of the Colorado Fiscal Institute. After earning a degree in global ethics from William and Mary, Caroline began working in Washington, D.C. as a research assistant at 2020 Vision, a small economic policy firm, and she fell in love with fiscal policy. How many people do you know that fall in love with fiscal policy? She put in a year and a half on federal tax policy, but she knew she wanted to be at the state level where more could get done. Colorado appealed to her for our outdoors, rock climbing, and of course, how much work there is to do to fix our broken tax code. And we'll hear more about that when she speaks. Caroline joined CFI as tax policy analyst in 2020, providing research and analysis of state fiscal policy issues and advocating for policies that bring equity and prosperity to all Coloradans. She took the role of legislative coordinator in December of 2022 when she works to coordinate and provide strategy to all legislative advocacy efforts. Shara Robert is a name you are likely to know. She is an emeritus advisor at the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. With expertise in policy advocacy and coalition building, Shar has dedicated her career to helping people meet their basic needs and expand economic opportunity. After 10 years as CCLP's legislative director, she stepped down into a new emeritus advisor role with the organization. She continues to work with Skills to Compete Colorado, a coalition, and serves on the executive committee of All Families Deserve a Chance. That's the AFDC coalition. For over 25 years, she directed the Women's Commission for the City and County of Denver. She was a founding board member of MICASA Resource Center, Women's Lobby of Colorado, and the Colorado Consumer Health Initiative. She is also on the executive committee of the Colorado Social Legislation Committee. Cher earned her master's degree in communications from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And our third speaker is our very own Andrea Wilkins. She is the legislative liaison for the League of Women Voters of Colorado. Andrea has a diverse policy experience with a primary focus on human services, poverty, and the amelioration of poverty, aging policy, good governance strategies, Indian law, and state and tribal relations. As part of her current portfolio of work, she provides lobbying services for the State League of Colorado, where she supports the advocacy training workshop and annual legislative conference. She also promotes coalition building by engaging stakeholders and coalition partners. She performs direct lobbying activities and provides guidance to support our volunteer lobbyists to maximize their impact. Andrea is founder and principal with Allied Agenda, specializing in policy development and implementation, advocacy, and coalition building. She holds a JD and a master's in international relations and public policy from the University of Denver and a bachelor's in political science and women's studies from the University of Mexico. As you can see, these are all highly qualified speakers. I will now turn it over to our presenters. Audience, please know that your voices will be muted during their presentations, but feel free to pose questions or comments in the chat. League of Women Voters of Denver's Communications Co-Director, Pearl Anzalani, will monitor the chat and facilitate the Q&A after the briefing. We will open for voiced questions from you if there is time. I believe Caroline is going to begin the talk tonight about the state budget this year. Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right, I'm about to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Yay. All right. Thank you so much to the League for having me here tonight. Like Susan said, my name is Caroline Nutter. I am the legislative coordinator at the Colorado Fiscal Institute, and today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about sort of our fiscal situation and our budget outlook this year. We like to start all of our presentations off with a little bit of level setting. So this is a chart that shows our appropriations, basically like what our entire state budget is by that fund's source. So as you can see, we have basically broken down into thirds. Federal funds, which is money that we get from the federal government, mostly for Medicaid. We have cash funds, which are funded by fees. So things like the Highway Users Trust Fund, that's funded by motor vehicle registration fees, are cash funds. And then our general fund, which is sort of our biggest piece of this bar chart, $15.5 billion. And our general fund is really sort of what we talk about at the legislature when we have the long bill in March. That's what we're talking about with our general fund. So the general fund is kind of the most important piece for the state budget. But cash funds are also really significant. And then especially this year, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later in the presentation, federal funds are also pretty important. So we just wanted to level set, show sort of the scope and the size of these funds before I got into the state budget or our general fund. So this is our general fund. So this is that $15.5 billion now in a pie chart. And this chart really shows exactly what we spend the money on. You'll note here that K through 12, healthcare, and higher ed are really our biggest pieces of this pie. And actually, this is one of the first years ever that healthcare has outstripped K through 12 funding. So usually healthcare is about 29% and K through 12 public school funding is 32, 33%. And this year they've switched, and healthcare is actually our biggest piece of the pie. You'll see here some other pieces. We have human services, which is a lot of our benefits programs and sort of the administration behind those, like SNAP and WIC and TANF. We have corrections, courts, judicial, and then just other, which includes things like our Department of Natural Resources. But again, K through 12 and healthcare are really our two biggest chunks. And you can see that they've also kind of shifted and grown a little bit. So K through 12 used to be a much bigger piece of our pie back in 2014. And now healthcare policy and financing our healthcare section is a little bit bigger of a piece. That blue column on the left is from 2014, and then that purple column on the right is 2024 or this year. One thing to note a little bit about our K through 12 changes is that a lot of that actually has to do with the local share of K through 12 funding going up. And so you'll see here that in 2018, we were collecting about $2 billion in property taxes. By 2024, we were collecting almost $4 billion in property taxes. Property taxes almost exclusively go, or they go about half to three quarters to pay for our K through 12 public schools. And you can see that from 2018 to 2024, the share of K through 12 funding has really shifted. In 2018, the state paid for about 2/3 of our K through 12 funding statewide. And in 2024, that ratio dropped to about 55%. And really, what that is showing is that the share that our property taxes have been paying for has gone up. How is that possible if our property taxes, the rates haven't gone up? That's because our property values have really skyrocketed since 2018. And so you can see the effect that this has on our general fund is that it actually takes some pressure off the general fund, and it allows the state share of school funding to go down. And so that's what's been happening in school funding for the last few years. As a result of that, we have actually been able to eliminate this thing that we call the negative factor. The negative factor is basically an accounting trick that we had to implement after the Great Recession. It's an IOU to schools. So a school district will maybe get $100,000 and we owe them, $1,000. And so what they really get is they get a lower amount than what we're saying that we're giving them. And we do that through adding a negative factor to that school financing formula. And that negative factor is shown here in this chart. You can see how big the negative factor has been The biggest being in 2020, we owed $1 billion to schools. So collectively, over the last 15 years, we have owed about $9 billion to schools in total. And in large part, because of how fast property prices have been going up, you can see that in the last few years after the pandemic, our budgets, our BS factor or negative factor has gone down to almost zero. And that's for the first time since 2009. So that's really, really significant. And one of the big budgetary questions this year is going to be, can we keep the BS factor this low, the negative factor this low? So that's going to be something to watch because that's going to be a really big debate when it comes to our budget this year. So this is a chart that shows our general fund and the cap that we have because of Tabor. So you can see our general fund growth since 1996, and you see that gray line. That's our Tabor limit base or our original Tabor cap from 1992. You can see that in 2005, we actually implemented a new cap, and that's from Referendum C, which voters passed at the ballot in 2005. We had a 5-year timeout, and then we started our new cap growth from the revenue that we collected in 2009. And we don't have something called the ratchet down effect anymore because of Referendum C. We just grow year over year. And so recessions are not as big of an issue as they once were when we just had our original Tabor cap. But really, what's significant about this chart is you can see the amount of money that we have returned to taxpayers because of our Tabor surplus. So when the general fund pushes over that cap, we have to return that excess money or surplus to the taxpayers. We do that in a number of ways. I'm going to show us in the next slide. But I really want us to look at the scale, the sheer scale of how much money we've been returning. Because what I'm also going to talk about a little bit is our budget shortfall. And it might seem counterintuitive that we have a budget shortfall when we're returning money, but that is just living in a state with Tabor. But as you can see, our Tabor surpluses have gotten a little bit smaller. Our general fund has grown a little less quickly than it was growing during the pandemic. But we're still going to have pretty sizable Tabor surpluses, especially starting next year and the year after. We're kind of going back into the billions, whereas this year we're only returning about $350 million. And that's also a significant number because it's about 2% of our general fund forecast, our revenue forecast for the next year. And that means that we're kind of in a situation where there could be a forecast error that puts us below the Tabor cap. We haven't been below the Tabor cap since 2020. And what that means is that budgeters, the legislators that are doing the budget, are no longer budgeting to the cap. They are budgeting to what we have brought in our revenue. And so it means that our general fund is even more constrained than if we were budgeting over the cap. So this shows how we distribute those Tabor refunds when we have a surplus. We've done a lot of changes to this in the last 4 years alone. And I will say that unfortunately, the time that you are getting $750 checks signed by Jared Polis is unfortunately over. There was a lot of legal issues with sending back equal amounts to everyone in Colorado, especially at that scale. A lot of Tabor issues and legal issues that the IRS was dealing with about whether or not they would be taxed. And so we sort of had to switch tax and do something a little bit different with those refunds. But basically, we have property tax refunds that are going to the senior homestead property tax exemption. Those are going to be funded for the next 4 years. Just based on our forecast estimates. We have an income tax rate reduction that will be triggered on into effect next year and the year after. And then we will be returning rebates to people directly in their tax refunds as well, but they will not be that sheer size of refund that you were seeing earlier, unfortunately. They're probably going to be more like the $30 refunds that we were getting in 1999. All right. I wanted to go a little bit into some of the things that the governor recommended for the budget this year because there's some interesting stuff in some of his recommendations. And for those of you that don't know, the governor submits a budget proposal on November 1st. And the JBC, the Joint Budget Committee that creates the long bill, takes into account some of those recommendations, but they ultimately do craft their long bill within the JBC and their staff. But here are some of the interesting recommendations that Governor Polis has suggested, and sort of CFI's take on what they are. So the first one, again, is this BS factor conversation. We really don't want the BS factor coming back. And so legislators and the governor are very, very focused on making sure that we eliminate the BS factor forever. And so what does that mean in a really tight budget year? It means a little bit of finagling. So first of all, we might tap some money from our Building Excellent Schools Today cash fund for school finance. Technically, that cash fund can only be used for capital construction, but it could be used to ease some of the budget pressures in the K through 12 budget if we can use some of that cash fund money for the general fund, general operation budget of K through 12 funding. We are going to push the full implementation of our new school finance formula out an extra year. So that was a bill that passed last year, spearheaded by Speaker McCluskey, and it basically just gave a little bit of extra money to certain types of districts based on different metrics than what we were using before. But pushing that out just has the effect of saving a little bit of money this year. And then another thing that he has suggested, which is interesting, is using a 1-year pupil count instead of a 4-year average. What that really does is for schools that are seeing precipitous drops in enrollment, which we know is happening across Colorado, the 4-year average kind of gave them a little bit more of a cushion before their funding was cut. Using a 1-year average doesn't give them that cushion. It really kind of says, this year your student enrollment dropped, and so this year we are going to take the amount of money out of your budget that is proportional to that drop for this year instead of over 4 years. So these are all kind of ways to make up some of that K through 12 money that we're going to see some pressure in. Another interesting one, this is kind of wonky, but he has proposed decreasing car registration fees to fee up general fund dollars. And this is sort of for you Tabor heads in the room. Our Tabor cap includes both general funds and cash funds, but our surplus dollars can only be paid out of the general fund. And so actually when cash funds get bigger, when we collect more fees, it puts a lot of pressure on our general fund and it sort of shoots more of the general fund over our cap. And so taking away some of those fees, even though it has the effect of reducing our ability to pay for really important things that car registration fees pay for, like road maintenance, it does take pressure off of the general fund a little bit. So that's just an interesting piece that he suggested. We know that Medicaid is going to be a really big deal this session and has already been a really, really big deal. So as you saw in that original pie chart, healthcare has grown bigger than K through 12 funding as a share of our budget for the first time ever this year. Medicaid is a huge part of that. It makes up most of our healthcare spending, and it has grown a lot faster than health officials are expecting. And so we're already dealing with Medicaid unwind, which is basically the loss of pandemic relief funding. And so there's a lot of risk with our Medicaid spending with this unwinding because of the pandemic relief dollars that are expiring. And also, as I'm going to get into in a little bit, there's a lot of risk that we are going to lose federal matching dollars for Medicaid. And so this budget proposal that the governor put out on November 1st, it calls for no annual increase to our provider rate for caseload growth or inflation, which is a huge hit to a area of our budget that clearly has a lot of need and that is also facing a lot of threats. So Medicaid is really something that's going to be very important in this year's budget. And then finally, some of the other things we're watching. Are they going to dip into their general fund reserve? We have a healthier general fund reserve than we have had in, I think, 30 years. We have almost never hit our 15% goal for our general fund reserve. And with the pandemic increasing our tax revenue, we have actually been able to hit that reserve goal. And so could we dip into that? That's a potential option. Another thing that CFI has been watching really closely is our family affordability tax credit bill, which is a bill that CFI helped to pass last year that gives up to $3,200 to families making up to $100,000. So really both working class and middle class families, a huge tax credit. It's really, really significant. It's super important. And so we're really on alert to see if there's going to be any kind of decreases to that program. For now, it is expected to dole out the full amount to the full eligibility of families. So that's great. Another thing that we're watching is we had a very big ballot this year, and a lot of things on the ballot had really big fiscal notes. One of them was Prop 130, which was diverting, I think it was $350 million to local police departments and just police forces from the state budget, which we do not do. Historically, Colorado has not funded local police departments with state dollars. So that was a brand new sort of hit to the budget that we're having to deal with, $350 million to be paid sometime over the next 10 years. And that's something that voters passed, so we do have to comply with it. So that's another budget pressure. Our December revenue forecast was on December 15th. The budget shortfall got marginally better. We were expecting a $900 million shortfall, and now we're only expecting a $670 million shortfall. So the situation is a little better. We actually added 91 students on net this year, which is great because our state enrollment has actually been declining for the last few years. So things are looking up a little bit, but we're still in pretty dire straits. And we know that budgeting to the taper cap, again, the fact that we are giving money away in surplus, but we still can't keep up with things like caseload growth, controlled maintenance, and inflation, means that our state budget just really can't keep up with the programs that we're trying to do. And so again, our budget is $670 million short of keeping up with inflation, caseload growth, and controlled maintenance. If we didn't have the taper cap, we'd have about 500 million more in spending that we would be able to use. And last year we gave back $1.5 billion. So budgeting to the taper cap is just, it's endlessly frustrating, it's arbitrary, and it makes it really difficult to keep up with things like our growth in Medicaid and our growth in student enrollment. Finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about just some of the federal changes that could affect Colorado. So Colorado is a rolling conformity state, meaning that any changes to the federal tax code automatically change our tax code. And spending cuts, like to Medicaid, because we have a 50-50 Medicaid match with the federal government, if they cut half of their match, then we are being forced to make up 25% of our Medicaid budget. So a lot of changes to the tax code and spending cuts will and can roll through to Colorado and have a very big effect on our state budget. There are a lot of threats specifically about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in 2017, and it is expected to expire this year. And we know that extending it and expanding it has been proposed. And that proposition is costs about four and a half, that's supposed to be trillion, $4.5 trillion. That the pay-fors that are being proposed to that are significant cuts to Medicaid and significant cuts to SNAP. We know that the TCJA in 2017 had a really disproportionate impact in Colorado. We know that the top 5% of Coloradan income earners received over half of the tax cut benefits, and the bottom 40% received only 5% of the benefits. So we're going to incorporate and expand and extend these cuts that don't really benefit most Coloradans at the expense of these programs that are already facing really big state budget threats. And we can't backfill any of the lost federal funds because of Tabor. So that's the end of the presentation. It's a little bit sad. Sorry about that. But we're just going to have to fight really hard to keep really important programs and especially focusing on schools, Medicaid, and SNAP this year. It's going to be a big defense year.
Thank you, Caroline. It's a new year, isn't it?
It is.
And our next speaker will be Andrea.
Thank you, everyone. Let me pull up my slides here. Hang on just 1 second. Okay, I'm hopeful that everybody can see the screen okay. Please yell at me if you can't. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the LWVCO session priorities in a couple of key areas. For those who don't know, my role with LWVCO is to provide logistical and technical support to our Legislative Action Committee, which is our lobbying corps comprised of, I think, around 35 citizen lobbyists, somewhere in that neighborhood. We lobby on a whole host of issues that range from government-related things to social policy to natural resources. So there's a much broader set of priorities than what I'll be covering here tonight. But I do want to point out to everybody that our legislative conference, our annual event, is coming up this Saturday from 10 to 2. So if you're interested in hearing a little bit more of a broader discussion than what I'll present to you tonight, I'd really encourage you to join us for that event. And in one of my slides, there's a link to the registration that you can navigate to. But for now, I want to focus on a couple of key things. Mainly, the things I want to talk to you about tonight really kind of fall into the category of voting and elections related legislation. And in particular, the Colorado Voting Rights Act is something I really want to highlight for everyone tonight and spend a little bit of time kind of going through the different components of that legislation and talk a little bit about the purpose. LWVCO was very involved in the development of this bill. We've been meeting in coalition on it with various partners that have been working on the legislation for well over a year now. So it's something that we consider a really big priority for the legislative session. And we were excited to see that introduced early on, first day of the session, as Senate Bill 001. Title of that is the Colorado Voting Rights Act. So to give you a little bit of background on this and sort of the diversity of voices and expertise that went into the development of this bill, LWVCO was made aware of the coalition through an effort that was taking place within the Harvard Law School Elections Law Clinic. One of the former LWVCO board members, Denise Miller, some of you may know her, is now a staff person with the Election Law Clinic. And they had taken an interest in looking at states that might be interested in providing additional protections at the state level that are really intended to complement and further enforce, and in some cases really go beyond what protections are provided in the Federal Voting Rights Act. And given the fact that, we have seen some concerning movement over the last several years now, aimed at really making accessing the ballot more difficult for certain groups of people. There's been concerns about voter intimidation. We just really felt that even though we have a really strong voting system and election system in Colorado, that more protections at the state level are something that could be really beneficial. So when we were approached by the Election Law Clinic, they were in the process of developing some model legislation that states could look at as sort of a starting point to figure out if it encompassed the priorities that were relevant in the state that they were working with, and just really kind of use that as a jumping off point for some further customization and a vehicle for adding those additional protections that might be needed in the state. So as I mentioned, everybody here, I'm sure, is very well aware that Colorado's got a really great elections administration system. But in coalition, we did spend a lot of time with various stakeholders that had come to the table to talk about, what could we do to ensure voting rights access, and provide some additional protections for groups that may have difficulty accessing the ballot and may face, sorts of discrimination or voter dilution, whether intentional or unintentional. So the result of those conversations was the bill that I'll be going through tonight, but that gives you a little bit of context for it. The coalition has been really broad-based. In addition to LWVCO, it includes Common Cause, the ACLU of Colorado, Fair Vote, America Votes, New Era, the Native American Rights Fund, NAACP, Mi Familia Vota, and I'm sure that there are many that I'm leaving out, but it just kind of gives you a sense of a lot of voices that came to the table to really kind of think through what we could do to really kind of beef up our protections for voting access in Colorado. And then the last thing I want to mention on this slide is that we are in the process of planning for a Colorado VRA lobby day at the General Assembly. That is scheduled to take place on March 3rd. I don't believe that is 100% set in stone yet, but we would love it if people would keep the date in mind. We will absolutely let you know if that changes. The State League will be putting out information on this, but we would love to have a really strong showing from League members during this lobby day. So please mark your calendars and we will keep you posted on that. Okay, so getting into the bill itself. It's sponsored by Senator Julie Gonzalez in the Senate, and then in the House, the prime co-sponsors are Representative Jennifer Bacon and Representative Jeannie Joseph. It was introduced in the Senate, and it is set to go to a hearing in Senate State Affairs. Right now, we are ironing out a few what I would consider to be minor, more technical in nature amendments. And so there is a little bit of behind the scenes work still taking place. And as a result of that, we do expect a hearing date sometime in mid-February, but we don't have the exact date on that set, nor is the fiscal note on this fully prepared and available. Still a couple of things to iron out a little more fully. But broadly speaking, the bill itself aims to provide those additional protections that I referenced against specifically discriminatory voting rules or elections practices, while also increasing the ability of communities of color to challenge unfair district maps that can lead to vote dilution and really suppression of the vote. Really kind of the key vehicle that we're seeing here in terms of how these protections would come about is that through the bill, there's the creation of a cause of action that an individual or an eligible organization, an organization that would have standing, can bring a complaint with allegations of voter discrimination, vote suppression, that sort of thing. And it could be the aggrieved individual themselves, or it could be an organization such as the League that works on behalf of voting rights and voter access. Essentially, anything that we're seeing that's, violating voter rights and, essentially causes us as an organization to really kind of go above and beyond to get around and try and overcome those discriminatory voting practices, that would confer standing on an organization to be able to pursue that cause of action. So a really important tool there in terms of trying to get at remedies for this kind of situation. Okay, so in terms of the components of the bill, there's, in addition to that overarching purpose and goal that I mentioned, we are looking to beef up voter access and provide some additional protections as well. And the bill is doing that in really kind of 4 key ways. There's sort of 4 categories where we're seeing specific additional things being required that are intended to provide more protections for certain voters. You can see here, I've got those briefly listed pertaining to individuals on tribal reservations, individuals with disabilities, individuals that may not speak English at a comfortable level to actually feel comfortable voting in English, and then improved elections related data collection, which was a big piece of the bill that the League was very, very involved in. And I'll get to that in just a little bit. But to start, let's talk a little bit about that first category. So efforts to improve access for individuals that are living on tribal reservations, there's 2 things that have been tweaked a bit in existing law within this bill. And one is that voter registration using the tribal council headquarters address or another address approved by the tribal council has to be established within each precinct of the reservation. And the reason for this is that some individuals with residences within the reservations in Colorado don't always have a residential address that is recognized by the U.S. Postal Service. So that can make it extremely difficult to actually register to vote. So, by dedicating an alternate address that voters can use as they're getting registered, that allows them to not only get registered to vote, but then receive their mail ballot just as anyone else in Colorado would do. Really kind of a provision there that's intended to open up access a little bit more. The other provision that I want to point out is that the tribal council can request a VSPC, Voter Service and Polling Center, on the reservation for election day itself, as well as any number of days during the 15-day period that's leading up to the election. So just another way of providing voters with more opportunity and more assistance in their voting process. Okay, so turning now to individuals with disabilities. there's a couple of things that are happening, and this provision here pertains to organizations that are providing state-funded supports or programming primarily for individuals with experiencing disabilities. So in terms of who has to do it, that's the category of entity that would need to abide by this provision. It's those that are, really receiving state funding to support individuals with disabilities. And as part of the requirement here, it's really kind of dealing with notice and education on voter rights. There's a requirement that there be a public display of information pertaining to voting registration, voting rights, and voting related accessibility accommodations. There also has to be information provided on the contact for the Secretary of State's accessibility coordinator. And there has to be identification of the location of the nearest drop box and VSPC. And that needs to be clearly posted in plain language in all of the buildings that an entity providing these services may operate within. So if we're talking about a large organization that operates, in sort of a campus structure and has multiple buildings, you'd have to see these notices posted in all of the buildings. If it's a smaller entity, really just housed within a single building, it would have to be posted there. But the idea is to make sure that individuals are getting this information and they know how to access additional support should they want that. Okay, now turning to the third component here, expansion of the multilingual ballot access that was the topic of legislation in Colorado a few years back. This was legislation that the League was in support of and worked in coalition to pass. The idea here was, as a matter of current law in Colorado, that counties that have got a certain percentage of individuals that speak English less than very well and speak another common language, that they need to provide a multilingual ballot in the language that is essentially qualifying, so individuals can study it and determine how they want to vote in a language that's comfortable for them. And then if they choose, the county clerk would also have to provide that multilingual ballot in person for the voter to actually vote that ballot if they chose to utilize that, as opposed to the English language version that gets mailed out to everybody. So what's happening under this provision of the Colorado VRA is that we're seeing an expansion of that initial effort at the county level, and we're seeing that extended to qualifying municipalities. So if you are a qualifying municipality, the municipal clerks are required to create that minority language sample ballot and provide the in-person minority language ballot, just the same as counties, impacted counties in Colorado have to. And qualifying counties or municipalities include those that have at least 2,000 citizens over the age of 18, or 2.5% of their citizens in the county that speak English less than very well. So that's sort of the qualifier there. And if the county or under the VRA, Colorado VRA, the municipality, if they hit that threshold, then they're subject to those multilingual ballot expansion requirements. Okay, and then finally, that fourth component is pertaining to elections-related data collection. And this is something that we're really excited about. This was really a priority for the League, something that we made sure to bring to the table when these discussions were first getting underway, because some of our members that have been involved in the data analysis pertaining to the independent redistricting commissions had noticed back when the process first got underway in 2020, that there are deficiencies in the type of data that's available in Colorado currently. And it really makes it difficult to run some of the analyses that are needed to determine compliance of the redistricting commissions with both the federal VRA and the other provisions that are set out in Colorado law that were established via amendments Y and Z that created the commissions. And it makes it really difficult to do a solid analysis in relation to racially polarized voting and other things that can help determine how boundaries should be drawn in a way that we won't get the unintended consequence of voter dilution of protected classes. So it's a really technical issue, and honestly, my knowledge of it is not very deep, but the important point that I want to convey to everybody is that through consultation with the league and our members that have been involved in this data analysis, we were able to get language in the Colorado VRA that will now require the collection of the data that will make more thorough analysis and just provide better support to the independent redistricting commissions going forward. So it's really exciting because I think that this is something that in a very league sense, it's very in the weeds, it's very technical, it's something that not a lot of people necessarily even know about, but it's so important to the successful implementation of Y and Z and how the redistricting commissions function that we just consider this so important that this provision is in the Colorado VRA. So I'll talk a little bit more about specifically what's happening here. In an overarching sense, all of this data collection is going to happen via the establishment of a statewide elections database and a new information office within the Department of State that will assist the state as a whole and the county. I'm realizing I have a typo in that shouldn't read states. It's going to assist the state of Colorado with compliance with the Colorado Voting Rights Act itself, but it'll also provide information and support in relation to best practices for elections administration and also support in investigating in any potential voting rights violations. There's also the requirement, as I was kind of getting at, that there will be, a mandatory collection of elections results for particular types of data that will allow for that improved analysis. That includes elections results for all primary elections and collections of precinct level election results that really will enable that racially polarized voting analysis. And the other really important component is that this data will be stored in a way that is accessible to the public, and it'll be retained for 12 years. So that will help us build a solid 10-year period and kind of really provide for that historical look that the redistricting commissions need to draw the boundaries in an appropriate way that's really based on an appropriate analysis and based on the data that's being collected. So we're really excited about that piece of the bill. All of the bill, really, but that piece in particular was really something that the league was very focused on. Okay, so that's a lot of high-level detail about Colorado Voting Rights Act. It's a pretty lengthy bill. It's around 35 to 40 pages. So there's other things in it that are important, but that's kind of the overall structure and purpose and context for how we got here and the process that LWVCO has been a part of. We will be discussing this a little bit more during the legislative conference on Saturday as well, but hopefully that kind of gives everybody a sense of what the act is attempting to accomplish. The other voting and elections piece that I want to mention for tonight is the work and the conversations that are taking place around vacancy committee reform. These are very much still live conversations and live efforts to craft solutions. So I don't have a lot that I can share with you this evening in terms of, solid legislative strategy or, possible language for ballot initiatives. LWVCO is at the table for these conversations, but they're very much still in development. So I wanted to actually talk a little bit more about what the problem is and why this is something that we consider important and why we're involved in this effort. So it's been pretty publicized. I'm guessing that probably most of you are well aware of the fact that many seats in the General Assembly for some time now have been filled through vacancy committee appointment. So this is what's happening when somebody decides to give up their seats to take another position, whether that be in government or private sector. In the case of death, a vacancy committee becomes necessary. Sometimes people, resign their seat or drop out of a race after they made the ballot for a variety of reasons. But it's happening so frequently that we really kind of hit a high point last year during the 2024 session, where nearly 30% of the seats in the General Assembly had been filled with the vacancy committee appointment process. And this really has, I think, pushed the idea of reform to the forefront of many stakeholders in the community, many citizens. And this is something that's, very much been on the mind of LWVCO for a while now. So we're really pleased to be part of these conversations and to hopefully shape the solution that will be forthcoming. The problem here is that, vacancy committees, they're comprised by party insiders that are selected through the caucus and assembly process, which doesn't involve a lot of people. These are not well-attended events. The number of people that eventually get appointed to the vacancy committee to select the individual that will basically serve as the elected official to replace the one that is no longer holding the seat. It tends to be such a small percentage of the overall voters in the district that essentially a handful of people are deciding on who is going to represent the people of that district. And, from the league perspective, it's just not a very democratic process. And because it's been happening more and more, and it tends to perpetuate itself as well. Most appointees do end up retaining their seats, even when it comes time for them to run in the next election, because the power of the incumbency is really significant. Name recognition becomes huge. There's just many more resources available for incumbents. And so we just see so many people that are holding their seats as a result of vacancy committees. It's just something that's become rather concerning. So I will say, even though I don't have a lot of details for you tonight, we are in the process of reviewing draft legislation. There's reforms that are being pursued through legislation likely to take the form of a referred measure. But there's also conversations that we're participating in that, are more geared towards the development of, a ballot initiative, really kind of taking the citizens initiative approach to things. So a lot to come here, but, we do hope to really kind of take advantage of the momentum and the desire and political will there seems to be to hopefully tackle this situation. There's been some previous attempts to find remedies that have not been successful. So, sometimes it takes various iterations to kind of get to the thing that really hits on it. And that's what we're hoping to do as we continue to participate in these discussions. All right, so shifting away from voting and elections related legislation, I did want to touch on a couple of other big areas where the Legislative Action Committee of LWVCO tends to be very active. One of them is education, and really, I think to sort of maybe just kind of piggyback off of some of the things that Caroline had mentioned, the concerning budget situation and education funding levels, I would say tend to be really just sort of the ongoing concern of most stakeholders in the community. But certainly this is something that LWVCO is watching and is concerned about, given the really difficult budget situation that we're entering into, contrasting that with the progress that has been made in terms of the elimination of the budget stabilization factor. We really don't want to see backsliding there, but we know we are dealing with a difficult budget climate. So there's just a lot of concern about where we're going to end up there. The other concern that we've had for some time, and certainly this year is no different, is funding for not just K through 12 education, but higher education as well. We tend to be concerned about the accessibility of higher education due to increasing tuition costs, which I think in a lot of ways plays into an even bigger concern about just the rising cost of living in Colorado across the board, where people are concerned about the cost of education, but they're also concerned about the cost of housing and the cost of groceries and childcare and all the other things that individuals and families have got to try and stretch their dollars to make ends meet. And when we may not be able to invest as much in higher education as we would like, we do get concerned about where that is going to leave us as a state. We get concerned about rising tuition. So I would say that right now, the LAC has not taken a stance on much education-related legislation yet, but a lot of the focus and the concern is really kind of on the funding picture and where that's going to lead us. And I think my final slide, or final area that I just wanted to kind of briefly touch on is affordable housing. Our affordable housing citizen lobbyist team is looking at a whole host of bills. This has really been a priority issue for the General Assembly and LWVCO for several years now because of the affordability crisis that's been happening in Colorado. The rising rates of homelessness, just housing insecurity across the board is a big, big concern. And so really looking to legislation that can hopefully, start to tackle some of our most pressing issues here in terms of affordability and availability of housing, and also protections for renters and individuals that have got housing, but may find themselves in a housing insecure situation. If those renter protections are not in place and enforced and that sort of thing. So these are kind of the issues that are front of mind as we are advocating on affordable housing related legislation. Again, our housing team is looking at a number of bills right now, but we've just had one legislative action committee meeting so far, but we have approved stances on the 3 bills that you see here on this slide. The prohibition on price coordination between landlords, tenant and landlord law enforcement bill, and the bill dealing with support surrounding necessary documents. We've taken a support stance on all of those. And just to give you a very high level overview of what these are doing, House Bill 1004 is looking to prohibit the use of algorithmic software that would allow landlords basically to coordinate and coordinate on the price of rent, really kind of trying to manipulate the market there and reduce competition and that sort of thing. So that is something that we are concerned about. This bill is attempting to address that practice, and it's something that we support. The tenant and landlord law enforcement bill, another bill that we support, It is looking to provide additional support for enforcement of renters' rights under Colorado law by granting counties, cities, and municipalities the power to bring civil and criminal actions to enforce certain landlord-tenant laws. And it also clarifies the power of the Colorado Attorney General to bring a civil or criminal action for enforcement of landlord and tenant laws. So some additional protections that might be made possible under this bill through increased or strengthened enforcement. And then the last one I want to mention is Senate Bill 8. The Necessary Documents Program is actually something that exists in Colorado already. It's been a program that provides financial support in the form of vouchers to individuals that need to obtain necessary documents. We're talking things like birth certificates, driver's license, things that would establish identity or citizenship, those sorts of things that are really essential for securing a place to live. So it's definitely kind of a cross-jurisdictional issue in terms of all the areas that it could, or programs that it could potentially implicate. But our housing team was really wanting to come out in favor of this bill because it's not possible to enter into a lease and secure housing if you don't have the appropriate documentation. So the program would seek to increase funding that's available so more need could be met in Colorado. It's eliminating the voucher program, which was proving difficult for individuals to use, and it would just be a department reimbursement system for documents that are actually provided without charge. And the individuals that are eligible for the program it's really kind of a broad swath of people, but low-income individuals, individuals that have experienced, sort of natural disaster and had documents destroyed, individuals that have experienced domestic violence and had to flee and leave things behind. So it's really kind of a whole host of people that may find themselves in a situation where they don't have access to their documents, they need replacements, but just the financial support for getting those documents is really, really essential to them. So we wanted to come out in support of this because it really is looking to make that process easier, and hopefully, even in the budget climate that we're in, maybe provide a little bit more funding, because as it stands right now, the program reaches just a very small piece of the population that is both eligible and in need of this program. So really essential to being able to secure housing. So we're supportive of that as well. And with that, I just have a little link here. This does not look great, but I think it will do the job of taking you to the registration for the LWVCO Legislative Conference on Saturday. If you are available to attend, we would love to have you join us. You can register through the link there, and I believe the slides will be shared. If anybody needs assistance with that or has questions about any of the rest of this, I look forward to our discussion that's forthcoming, but also feel free to get in touch with me at any time. And I'll turn it back over at this point.
Thank you, Andrea, very much. And I'll move on to Shar.
Hi, I'm Shar Robert. And the way I understand I have 10 minutes. So the way it's going to be structured is, for the first 3 minutes, I'm going to talk about interim committee bills. As of this weekend, there were 140 bills already introduced, and 35 of those bills came from interim committees. The second third, I will be flagging some housing related bills, since I know that's a top interest, and I'm glad we have a couple of those checked off right now. And then the third 3 minutes, I'll be talking about what Colorado Center on Law and Policy is up to. So that's the way I see the flow. And thank you, Pearl, for pulling it up. So interim committees, I'm sure you're aware, their purpose is to take a deeper look into issues that seem pressing. And by deeper, I mean maybe spending, 20 to 60 hours on a bill, 60 hours, including like all the background reading and field trips, etc. And so it's not necessarily like a four-year degree in the subject, but it's a much deeper look than can happen during our 120-day session. So there actually were a lot of interim committees this past year. There are some years where there've been no interim committees. They have they have a bipartisan group of legislators generally. Some have non-legislators on them, and some, I would say most probably don't. And the committees are bipartisan. That doesn't mean the bills that were approved had bipartisan support. But the committees themselves that vet it are bipartisan, and they have to finalize which bills are moving forward. They're usually limited to a set number of bills, and they have to have that all lined up by October, which is why they get introduced in the exact same form that they get approved, which is why they're some of the first bills out the door. So I'm going to run pretty quickly through these. This is actually in alphabetical order. One of the interim committees was the American Indian Affairs Interim Committee study. And they were only allowed to do 3 bills. That was their allotment. So one of the bills, the first bill, is to continue the committee. It's amazing how many issues they tried to vet in their meetings over the summer. They also spent a couple days on some of our reservations here in Colorado. So the first bill would continue the American Indian Affairs Interim Committee. They did not get to issues like land acknowledgement. They did not get to issues like having legislation written in a way where it's clear whether it applies to people on the reservation or whether it doesn't apply because of their sovereignty as a separate nation. The second one would require other state agencies to recognize court orders from tribal courts. And then the last one relates to reclassifying wild bison as wildlife, and therefore they cannot be killed except if the state of Colorado, approved that killing. And so those were the 3 that were ready to move forward. I'd say one thing that makes bills ready to move forward in this era is minimal fiscal notes. Okay, if you could move down a little bit. There's an artificial intelligence impact committee that did not come up with bills, that wasn't in their charge. And they're going to be around for a few years to look at the impact of artificial intelligence and how policy should address any concerns about that. There was an interim committee on cell phone connectivity. They were allowed 3 bills dealing with cell phones. There also is a longstanding Colorado Youth Advisory Council Committee, and they were allowed 3 bills. So one has to do with encouraging food waste reduction. The second one, create a youth health literacy oversight panel, is the only interim committee bill that has not yet been introduced. And then the last one is reserving a seat for youth on an environmental justice committee that already exists. The next one is the Language Access Advisory Committee. It also was not charged with coming up with bills, but rather recommendations to Legislative Council on how we can better, how the legislature itself can better reach out to and involve people for whom English is not their first language. The next one had to do with jail standards, and they came up with 3 bills: the financial assistance for some county jails, the right for people in custody to talk to a lawyer, and then a regional approach to having a county jail, because each county is supposed to have one, but to allow that to be done regionally. There was a tax policy task force, and a couple, I won't go through all of those. One that I found interesting is the state tax expenditures and grants database, which would actually get a public-facing website where people could check on if they might be eligible for certain of the tax credits, or for organizations to be able to find out, or businesses to find out what grants is the state putting out to bid. The senior housing tax credit extension, that is a housing bill, and it will do again. We've had it on a one-year basis twice. And the thought behind it is that we have the homestead exemption for homeowners who've lived in their, who are over 65 and have lived in their house for more than 10 years. But why are we supporting homeowners? And if you're a renter, you don't get any help. So it's to kind of make up for, to say senior renters need support, a tax credit as much as homeowners do. There's two committees that sound real simple or similar, the Pension Review Commission and the Pension Review Subcommittee. The subcommittee just deals with para and makes recommendations to the Pension Review Commission. And they're still struggling with para payments, state employee retirement plan. There is also a committee on the sales and use tax simplification. We have so many different government entities in this state that it can be very complicated to try to stay in compliance with sales tax. Okay, there's a statewide healthcare review committee, but it didn't even meet. There was a transportation legislation committee. They came out with their full 5. Most of those are not major. I mean, because of the budget constraints, it's, you know, like paratransit service, you would think that would be providing paratransit service, but it's to form a committee to look at paratransit services. The next committee is a longstanding committee, the treatment of people with mental health and behavioral health issues who are in the criminal justice system, dealing with some very, very challenging situations where our criminal justice system is used as the behavioral health system of last resort. And then finally, the Wildfire Matters Review Committee, and it was very interesting going through these bills the week of the California fires. I think they will be having very similar discussions about how do you address in policy something to help address wildfires. One of the larger bills is the second bill, 1078, which would put about $1 million into promoting firefighting workforce, starting with 4-H clubs and having other degrees and train the trainer on kind of how to work together as a community and to have a workforce who's there to fight fires when we need them. Okay, so you can stop sharing now. Pearl Ann, thank you very much. Just when I think I have it, sometimes I lose my screen share. So there's a couple more housing bills that I did want to bring to your attention because I think that is a big interest of the league. And beyond the two that Andrea mentioned, I would mention there is a bill that has not yet been introduced that I think will be really of interest to the league. By Representative Lindsay related to domestic violence victims and tenants' rights issues. And it's a very, at the moment, the draft is a very bold bill, which means it'll probably attract a lot of attention. It addresses both the tenants' rights laws and the eviction laws in terms of rewriting the laws to really accommodate the needs of survivors and victims of domestic violence. And I think that's definitely one to keep your eyes on. It should be out in the next couple weeks. In terms of some bills that have already been introduced, I mentioned the senior, the tax credit for seniors who are renters who don't get the homestead exemption. That will be out there. And let's see, there will be an interagency council on homelessness, which will be, we had one, but it will be recreated and housed in the governor's office to coordinate activities related to growing homelessness. And then there also is another bill on HOA foreclosures. There was a few years back, there was kind of a scandal of a lot of homeowners in the Montbello, Green Valley area, I think it was, who were losing their homes to foreclosure, but not by the bank, by the homeowners association, with seemingly not enough notice. So there's a bill on that topic. Okay, and lastly, I want to take a minute to talk about what Colorado Center on Law and Policy is up to. About 4 months ago, staff decided, well, we shouldn't commit to too much because with the Supreme Court coming up with the Chevron decision, which sort of changed the rules on the rules about rules, where the of who could really write rules, should it be the people who know the topic who are working in the agencies, or should that rulemaking really be done by Congress or the courts if there's some disagreement? And the Supreme Court thought it should be done by courts, not by technical experts in agencies. So we are expecting a lot of rules to be challenged. And so they wanted to leave space for that. 3 of the people I work with, we're a small agency. 3 of them are lawyers, and there's things only lawyers can do in terms of filing motions and a lot of in the weeds challenging rules and doing briefs. And obviously since then, we have a number of other challenges to rules and how do I say, can certain policy changes happen as proposed, or are they actually not legal? So we have saved a lot of space to be working on those kind of things, particularly federally in the Medicaid arena is sort of the expertise of the people I work with. In terms of bills, the bill I'm working on is Senate Bill 8, the Necessary Documents Bill, which is the one that Andrea already described. We did have to strike out any increased funding, or there was a guarantee that it would be gate killed immediately. But it does streamline the program so that hopefully it's more useful and less frustrating. We also are active on a couple of workers' rights bills with the coalition. We're not the lead, but we're part of the coalition on Senate Bill 5. That's the collective bargaining bill. It may be the most hated bill by some business interests because it would get rid of the Colorado only requirement to have 2 different votes related to unionization. The first with a majority to be able to form a union, and the second requiring 75% approval in order to actually negotiate on behalf of a union. There's also a bill, House Bill 1001. Last year, Representative Monica Duran did a wage theft bill to address people working and not getting paid for it. It was passed by the legislature, but vetoed by the governor. So she's back with a whole different bill. It won't be just construction. It will be wage theft in many arenas, and dramatically increasing the role of the Department of Labor in being able to enforce wage theft bills. We have also been working on a lot of language access issues. So we've had an interim committee on language access, and actually a lot of what they talked about included what we were doing on voting, which was interesting because in terms of voting, we're probably doing more than in a whole lot of other areas. So initially we're working with Spring Institute, and the initial thought was to create a state office of language access. However, the words create an office are a red flag this year because of the budget situation. And so CCLP's and Spring have been in contact with the governor's office and are working out an alternative way to have a task force to develop a language access plan for state agencies. Yeah, so it may be a bill or it may be not a bill because we no longer are saying create an office. And then first and foremost, I would say the mission of CCLP has been focused on defending Medicaid. We've heard both of our speakers referred to the big issue of Medicaid. And the only thing that hasn't been mentioned is, it's roughly a third of the budget this year. That with the Medicaid unwind, a lot of people got kicked off of Medicaid for either justifiable reasons or administrative issues. And that has left a lot of providers like community health clinics providing a whole lot more uncompensated care from people who used to be on Medicaid. So a lot of the providers who have been dealing and trying to make ends meet on Medicaid alone are now finding that their clientele, a portion has lost Medicaid, and so they're getting nothing for that uncompensated care. But we have folks who will be keeping a close eye on what's happening with Medicaid, both at the state level and the federal level. And that's it.
Thank you, Shar. It is about 7 o'clock, but we generally go beyond 7 for our Q&A. So please hang in there. We have a couple of questions that are in chat that Pearl Ann will address.
Sure. The first one's an easy one for Andrea, I believe. Will you please repeat the VRA bill number and bill sponsors?
Oh, sure. It's Senate Bill 1, and the sponsors are Senator Gonzalez and Reps Bacon and Joseph.
The next question, I think all three of you could speak to because you've all mentioned it. It's sort of the big topic, right? Are there any efforts being made or conversations occurring to refer a ballot issue to the voters to eliminate Tabor altogether? Reminder, it took Douglas Bruce 3 efforts to get Tabor passed. Is it not time to begin to reverse the process?
I can take a little bit of that because Tabor reform work is CFI, one of CFI's like top priorities this session. The short answer is yes, there are conversations and efforts being made, not necessarily to refer a ballot measure to repeal Tabor altogether, but to have the conversation about if we want to repeal Tabor, how would we do that? And what are some of the ways that we can reform Tabor right now? And there are a few things going on this session that would be of interest and relevant to this issue. So firstly, Representative Lorena Garcia is introducing a couple of bills that are challenging certain parts of Tabor. One of the bills that she is introducing is going to be a sort of a package of 2 referred measures. One striking the single rate income tax language mandate in the Constitution, which mandates us to have a flat income tax. And then referring basically a graduated income tax to the ballot, either a millionaire's tax or an increased capital gains tax or something like that. And then also giving legislators the ability to set those rates during times of an economic emergency. So that's kind of what makes it a little different from some of the other purely revenue efforts that are being made right now, because there are a lot of revenue efforts happening, but they're not really Tabor reform efforts necessarily. They are efforts to get revenue. And so what Representative Garcia really wants to do is like, what can we throw in a bill that is just like all the stuff that Tabor doesn't let us do, and see like what sticks, what we can have a conversation about. Another thing that a few legislators are coming together around is this issue of reclassification. And so when I spoke in my presentation a little bit about how cash funds put a lot of pressure on the general fund because they are included in our calculation of the Tabor revenue cap, even though cash funds cannot pay out refunds. We want to see what can we take out of the cash fund calculation and basically make it exempt from the Tabor cap to put less pressure on the cap and allow more money from the surplus to fall into our general fund so we can use it. That's kind of like a pushing the envelope type of question, because we've done this with smaller funds, but we've never done it with a fund that's say like $400 million big, right? So that's kind of what we're trying to do, is push the envelope with that. And then thirdly, there is a little bit of discussion around are there legal challenges that we can bring against Tabor? And there are a couple of legislators that are interested in bringing some resolutions that aren't necessarily bills in the same way, like they don't go to public testimony, but they will allow legislators to have a very explicit conversation about Tabor and the way it constrains us. So those are some of the things that CFI is working on. We are also planning to bring together a coalition of people that are interested in Tabor reform. We brought together some folks in December, but we're trying to find a facilitator. We're sort of like going around and bidding for a facilitator, because we want to have a facilitated discussion with a Tabor reform like group of people that are interested in that, to really like vision out what a Tabor repeal or replace would look like. And so those are a couple things that CFI is doing, but I'm not sure if there are other efforts going on as well.
All right. Another question is on Senate Bill 8. Is the goal of the bill to make a list limited to certain documents that would be used uniformly by all prospective renters?
No, that's not the purpose of the bill. So this is a program that's existed, I think it's about 8 years now. We worked on the original legislation. And the goal of the bill is to enable people to get as mentioned, either a driver's license, a birth certificate, because there's an awful lot of situations that require that. And it's not just renting a house, it can be picking up a prescription or getting a certain kind of appointment with your healthcare provider, or a police stop, or I mean, it just amazes me how many times I'm asked for an ID. And particularly people who have been experiencing homelessness get their ID documents stolen, either by other people, or they lose them in different enforcement activities, or just because they don't have a good place for them. Domestic violence victims sometimes lose ID documents, in escaping from a situation, or because they're stolen from the victim to keep the victim from leaving. And then it also is for victims of natural disasters. The year before it passed, when we were working on it, it was the floods in Colorado, where a lot of people had their homes swept away. And it came in handy during the Marshall Fire, where people could get their basic ID document back. But basically, it's a program to provide the driver's license, the birth certificate, and the documents that you need. It doesn't change the requirement for the documents. But one thing it does a couple things that make it easier to get the documents. One is that rather than having to go to a nonprofit who has already signed an MOU with a third-party administrating entity, which is currently Metro Caring, to get a piece of paper that is a paper voucher that expires in 30 days, and then get that piece of paper with you to a DMV that's located in a completely different place, often without transportation. At this point, only about 30% of those vouchers get redeemed, and so then they have to reissue them to try again. So the idea is, rather than do it that very cumbersome way, where the money is like flowing through 4 different entities before it gets to be used, that somebody could go into a DMV or to Vital Statistics and just get the document without this voucher. Unfortunately, because we were told to strip out any funding ask, there is a risk of the money, like money running out quickly. But part of it is to make it easier that you would need to just go to one place to do that. The other thing is you can self-attest, not that you are who you are, because that's sort of a much more complicated thing, but that you are either experiencing homelessness, or you are a victim of domestic violence, or that you have been part of a natural disaster, to eliminate having to get other documents to prove that you're eligible for a program to get a document. So at this point, what we're doing is trying to streamline it. And in the following years, we're going to fight for more funding for that. So it would help renters in the sense of if they need an ID to rent, and if there are funds available at the time that they're seeking that they could go to a DMV and get the ID, or go to vital statistics and get the birth certificate. So to replace lost documents or destroyed documents.
Those are the only questions in the chat. Sue, do you want to open it up to voice questions, or are we past time?
Let's see if anybody has a voice question. We can unmute you. And if you have a question that hasn't been answered, you can unmute yourself if we haven't been able to unmute you. Anybody else have any other questions? There was a lot of material covered here tonight. I think we have some good ideas about what's some of the things that are issues that both League and CFI and CCLP are interested in the upcoming legislative session. So thank you to all of our speakers. We really appreciate this information. Again, this has been recorded and will be put up on our website probably 2 to 3 days from now. Will be accessible on the website if you want to go back and look at any of the other slides or rehear any of what people had to say. Thank you to people who are here who are from other organizations. We're glad you're here. Be sure to join us again. And good night to all League members who are here as well. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Pearl Ann, for facilitating.
Thanks.